My guest today is Christian Klepp. Christian is a professional B2B marketer and a copywriter and has been one for the past 13 years. He says he's had the major privilege of working with B2B brands across different markets in Asia, Europe, and North America, and considers himself a global citizen and student of languages. Canada is the seventh country that he's lived in, and he's currently learning his fifth language, which is French. He also says he likes to sketch images of old buildings and temples in Shanghai in his spare time. In today's episode, Christian is going to talk about a major issue, which is B2B marketing content that is super boring. Why is B2B content so boring? What makes it boring? And what can B2B marketers do to make it a lot more engaging? Let's jump right in. All right, Christian, thank you so much for joining me today. This is going to be a lot of fun. I love this topic. I appreciate you taking the time.
Linda, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Yeah, before I get into our main topic today, I need to ask you, you say you're a student of languages. How do you learn a new language? Because I grew up with a Japanese mom, as you know, you and I have talked about. My dad was Italian, and both sides of the family knew those languages. I learned neither. I barely get through in English most days. So how are you Are you learning through an app sort of thing, or how do you do that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose I was fortunate enough to grow up in a multilingual household. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I spoke German with my late father, and that's the other language that I would say I speak to the same with the same level of fluency as English. And my mom is Filipino, and she. I mean, we mostly speak in English, but she also peppers it with there's a dialect in the central Philippines called Bisaya. So that's a language I also grew up with. Mm-hmm. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, like currently I'm learning French, and I'm doing that through an app called Duolingo.
Oh, okay.
But I did find that there were some limitations. For example, we did do a road trip to Montreal, and I said, okay, well, Duolingo doesn't exactly tell me how to order food in French. So I looked up something on YouTube, as you do these days, and there's a YouTube channel called Easy French, and it teaches you conversational French.
Oh.
But here's the catch. This Easy French channel teaches you how to speak it in the Parisian way.
Okay.
And let's just say that the French that they speak in Montreal is not Parisian, and sorry to anyone who's listening to this who's from Montreal, but it's true.
That is funny. Yeah, because I've tried Duolingo, but I don't have a reason or anyone I can speak to, so I just dropped it. But it's just interesting. But I've sometimes used like Google Translate. I've tried to, if we're watching a TV show that's dubbed, and I'll hold it up to the TV. And it's actually accurate but usually you can't hear it. It's not that clear. I've tried to use it when I get my nails done in the Vietnamese nail salons, and I try to catch what they're talking about me, but they don't talk loud enough. Someday I'll catch them saying.
That's actually a very complicated language. It's also another language that uses tones. And that basically means that if you mispronounce the words, they have different meanings, right? And that's one thing I learned the hard way when I started learning Chinese.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, my mom used to tell me that about Japanese, that there were two, ways you could pronounce something, and it would be two different words. But yeah, that's so interesting. So when it comes to, there's no real segue into our conversation today, but B2B content is known for being super boring. And you know how people have these fears about speaking on stage or all these different phobias. My phobia is being caught in a boring conversation I can't get out of. And that's like a fear of mine. And it's almost like that with when I come across boring content. Why do you think B2B content is so boring? A lot of it.
When I think about what B2B stands for, I mean, everybody knows it's business to business, but I actually tried to tell myself that it actually means from boring to brilliant. There's many reasons why, right? But I think at its very basic level, B2B traditionally has been known to have this mindset of let's be risk averse. Let's not try to rock the boat too much. Let's play it safe and do what we've always done.
Right.
but let's expect different results. And I know there's this controversy around that expression, and everybody's like, oh, Albert Einstein said it. And no, he didn't. But basically, it's the whole bit about insanity is like doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? So I think B2B has that problem, right? So there's that. I think also one that I've seen just working with B2B companies, especially the bigger ones, and correct me if I'm wrong, they become their own worst enemy because they have all these, I call them the brand Bibles, or these very strict guidelines that dictate this is what we should write about. This is the tonality. This is on brand. This is off brand, right? You shouldn't write like this. You shouldn't write like that. And if that brand Bible does not evolve and does not move with the times, then you get, and that in my experience, I think 8 times out of 10 is the case. Then you're stuck with this guidelines that are outdated, right? And then you're still stuck like with something that was probably made sense 10 years ago or 5 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. So the guidelines is another one. The other one, which I absolutely try to avoid like the plague, is internal politics plays a huge role, right? And you might think like, oh, well, what does that have to do with content? And I would actually say it has a lot to do with it, right? I've worked for some companies where articles have to be reviewed by 7 different layers, not people, layers, right? So different business units, different departments. This one has to make sure that it's on brand. This one has to make sure because it's about their product or whatnot that we're saying the right things. And so everybody needs to have their, I suppose, give it their blessing, or their approval, right? And to make sure that we're all saying the right things. So there's a lot of, and then everybody chimes in and gives their opinion about what should and shouldn't be said. Right. So you've got this whole decision by committee scenario going on. Right? Another issue which I see a lot, especially in bigger companies, is they tend to use the outside in versus the inside out approach. And what I really mean by that, for those of you listening out there, is they tend to just look inwards and make sure that everybody internally is aligned and everybody internally is happy with the content. Right. And then they release that content out into the wild and it doesn't perform.
Yeah.
Why? Because they didn't take the customer or the target audience or the target reader into consideration, right? Yeah. So it's basically just this whole, I call it the pleasing everyone internally game. Yeah. Which we all, you and I both know that that's a road to nowhere. Right? Yeah. At least if you want to make it, if you want to make it resonate with your target audience. And I think the last one I'm going to say is a lot of this content is also written under the assumption that the reader knows exactly what you're talking about. So right. what I mean by that is like, and I've worked with a couple of these guys in the past and continue to work with them, engineers, right? I mean, I'm not trying to like, say bash engineers here, but like, I've been involved in situations where I had to write an article or write some content, and we had to interview the engineering department. And the way they explain it to you is like they assume that you are an engineer too, and you know exactly what they're talking about. And I'm like, okay, let's take a step back and just assume that the person you're speaking to at the other end is not at your level, like in terms of being an engineer or whatnot. So how could you simplify that? Because they start dropping in all this like technical jargon, and then my beloved acronyms, right? There's so many acronyms and these abbreviations and etc. And it just becomes this big like you're half Italian, so it becomes this big minestrone, right?
A giant word soup, or
right, or it's just this complete mishmash of this and that, and and then you take a step back and you ask yourself, okay, so what are you trying to tell me here, right? Like, what is the purpose of this content? Like, what is it that you're hoping, people will take away from this? And are you expecting them to act upon it? What are you expecting? What are your expectations, right? So a lot of these factors come into play, but I would say off the top of my head, those are some of the key reasons why B2B is plagued with this boring content disease, right?
Everything, yeah, and I agree. Everything you said can refer to either content or also refers to copywriting. and
Yes.
trying to get a message out or creating messaging for unique messaging for a company is difficult when everybody wants their say. And what happens is it gets diluted. It ends up
Absolutely.
just, okay, well, we'll be safe. Everyone will understand it. And it's just, like you said, it's boring. And so having messaging, or whether it's content or copywriting, that stands out means stepping outside of that. And that is
Correct.
something that seems to be a big fear, especially if it's a big company. I have definitely seen that. And I like the phrase I heard on another podcast once about, they call it inhaling their own fumes. Like when you're in a boardroom and everyone just patting each other on the back about
Yeah.
how brilliant they are and this is great,
Yeah.
without thinking or even talking to their customers, or not considering
Mhm.
what their customers would be saying, and
Absolutely.
they're creating something on their own. Like when you said with, you know, with people who, like engineers, they don't
Yeah.
understand. And then they get upset when it's
Yes.
not just engineers, but anyone who is talking. Like I remember as a personal trainer, I would hear trainers in the gym
Yeah.
explaining something to a client, and
Yeah.
I could tell it was way over their heads. They don't care
Just
what
totally lost.
muscles they're using, describing the muscles and how they work. The person just wants flat abs. They don't care about any of this other stuff. So it's sort of like that. But
Yeah.
so what are
Absolutely.
ways? Yeah. What are ways that you can make B2B content more interesting and engaging?
This is something I try to live and breathe and practice, because that's one of the reasons why our raison d'être, to use a French term, right? Like our reason for being. And I tend to pass that on to my customers, right? When they say, okay, well, how can we make this more interesting? I'm like, okay, you take a step back and you ask yourself, like, to quote Simon Sinek, right? What's the why, right? What's the raison d'être? Why does your company exist? And don't start going on about your products and your features and your specs. Why do you exist as a business? Why do you provide the kind of solutions and products that you have at your disposal? What is it that you're trying to solve for your customer? Like, what is it that's keeping them up at night? What are all these challenges and pain points that they have that you can solve? Why did they, to your point in the interview the other day, why did they choose to work with you over somebody else, right? Because you guys are not working in isolation. You probably have a massive competitive ecosystem. Why did that customer decide to work with you, right? And so I say all of that to say you need to talk to your customers. Talk to your customers, but even before you do that, I would say I would advise customers to do what I call soul searching. So you do this internal deep dive, so-called, right, to answer all these questions that I just highlighted. And then you take that and then you go to the customer and then you ask them, okay, so what is it? Like, you compare notes a little bit, right?
Right.
And based on the answers that they give, and you extract those insights, and that will give you these, I call them the ingredients to craft that better story. And mind you, this is the illusion that I've seen this happen a lot in B2B. They think, oh, when I tell a story, it's got to be about us. No, the story has to be about how you help the customers to succeed.
Right.
Don't make it about you. Don't make it about your products and your proprietary technology. Nobody cares about that, right? So what I also think needs to, and I know this is still a work in progress in B2B, but you need to inject a storytelling element that also includes or has a bit of a human touch to it. Why? Because that creates authenticity. And short of sounding cheesy, I mean, I know it's companies to companies, but at the end of the day, you are dealing with people, right? And they don't act on impulse or emotions the way that people do in the in the consumer brand world. But at the end of the day, it's also about building trust and credibility. Because you think about it, right? A lot of these people, like, I think it was it was Gartner, right? So if you're looking at the Gartner came out with a report about the B2B buying journey, right? And they're talking about, I think that the stat was anywhere between 80 to 82%. 80 to 82% of B2B buyers would prefer to conduct their own research on said service provider and come come to an informed decision through what they can find that provides that validation without ever talking to the service provider's salespeople.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that tell you? That tells you that they don't want people calling them and spamming them and pitch slapping them and telling them, hey, Linda, let's get on a demo call. They don't want any of that.
Yeah.
What they want to do is they want to go and do their own independent research. And it's important that they are able to find something that will help them to build trust with you. And what is that certain something? I mean, I would hazard a guess that it's content. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've heard that before. In fact, the statistic I heard is that people are 80% of their way towards making a decision about you when they get on the phone with you. Right. So they have all this research they've done on their own. Yes. And there's now, I mean, the way it is now especially with AI, you can find out so much information before you talk to anybody. And they've almost made up their mind. And so they don't want to be convinced. Yes. They want to see, what you're about without your telling them how great you are. One of the things, and I've seen this, I'm not a big fan of his, but we happen to see it a lot. And Guy Fieri has this show that's like all about, it's on the cooking channel. And it's, he goes on these road trips and goes to all these different restaurants. And he always starts with the story behind that restaurant, where the people are from. Usually it's an ethnicity thing. They've come from, a different country and they wanted to make it big and they opened this restaurant. But it's always about the story, about the family or the origin. And because it adds that human element. And then they walk into the restaurant and they introduce all the food and how it came about, and it adds that it's not just like, okay, here's another burger joint. Because no one cares, it's like, well, why is it that you're doing this? Why do you make your burgers upside down? I don't know, whatever it is that they do.
Exactly. And and you work on, you've worked with clients like this in the past as well, and I'm sure. But if you just look at some of these B2B websites, right, and especially the more corporate ones, I mean, they're the I would say the repeat offenders, because the homepage on their website is a picture of the facade of a tall skyscraper.
I know,
right? And then the About Us section is a picture of an empty conference room. And I'm like, okay, so what are you trying to tell me here? Like, is this commercial real estate and you're selling this empty office space,
it's
or what
so
are you
accurate.
doing?
Yeah,
right. And I've seen that changing. Like there was a company I worked with in the past. I'm not going to say who they are, but like they're in the semiconductor space, right? And they made that migration where they added a bit more of a human touch to their brand. So from one day to the next, literally, when they migrated their website, suddenly you saw people's faces, stories of the engineers, stories of how their team worked with the client's team to achieve a certain milestone, right? And it added that human element. And clearly semiconductors, this is a very intensely B2B segment, right? In the market.
It's interesting because I did work with a hospitality tech company a couple years ago. And the website was all like you described it. It was pictures of somebody on their phone. You didn't see their face. You just saw their hand. And everything was very tech. And it was tech, but it was family. It's a family-owned hospitality tech business. And no one knew that. And so I worked with the designer and we redid the entire website, and the copy now includes somebody in a hotel, like shaking the hand of the customer. It's very that human element that people wanted. And it adds so much warmth, and the designer added, warm colors to it, whole different feel. And it's like night and day, so is there any niche like industry where this doesn't work, or what are some differences maybe between them?
In my experience, I feel that this approach is applicable across the board. I think where it gets a little bit tricky and where you have to be a bit more careful is if it's a bigger corporation and you're dealing with multiple brands, right? So what I mean by that is, like, for example, and I'm sure you've heard it, like, the branded house versus the house of brands. And for those of you that don't know the difference, is a branded house is, just think of Virgin Group, right? And then a house of brands is like P&G and all the brands that fall under that. Okay. So whenever you're expanding that portfolio, so to speak, and you're launching a new brand, then you have to come up with a different, like a brand story for that brand, right? And it's not just a brand story, but it's the way that you tell the story about the brand, and you use that angle and that approach, which then permeates into the rest of the content. I would say that that's where I've seen, okay, you have to use a different approach because it's a bit more diversified.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Can you give an example of like a story behind a brand that helped land, like that story helped land that brand on the map?
So I've been thinking about this one. I don't know if these exactly like landed these brands on the map, but they definitely stood out and it got significant media coverage, right? So the first one is BCLP. So it's an international law firm that mainly deals with companies in the finance industry.
Mhm.
And they came up with, I mean, that's pretty dry if you ask me, but like,
Yeah.
So it's a global law firm that deals with companies in the financial industry, and what they really wanted to do is convey that message about their core competency in terms of how the company knew how to help bankers get out of sticky financial situations or issues. So the company's marketing team decided, and I thought this was super clever, and I'm happy to send links after this conversation. They created a series of Ocean's 11 inspired YouTube videos telling cautionary tales, is what they call them, about what will happen if bankers fail to heed regulatory advice. And they called it cautionary tales, and it's filmed in that style, right? Ocean's 11, but it's all black and white.
That sounds
so
great.
I thought that was really clever, and I think it was according to B2B marketing.net. So that's they're based out of the UK.
Uh-huh.
That campaign generated 515% more leads than the campaign target.
Wow.
Or BCLP.
Yeah.
Right? So that's pretty impressive. You should go have a look at it if you haven't heard of it. The other one that comes to mind, which certainly put this brand on the map for me, was Cisco. So Cisco has this division. I mean, Cisco is another one of these companies, and case in point, they've got a massive product portfolio, right? And it's all in like technology and software and whatnot. But they had this specific branch which is dealing strictly with cybersecurity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cybersecurity and cybersecurity issues. So what did these guys do? They took a unique approach to, it's a very complex subject, right? Cybersecurity. And their target audience obviously are CTOs, CISOs, CIOs, okay? So they put those challenges that these guys are facing on a daily basis into an immersive graphic novel, right? So they came up with this comic book, basically that talked about like cybersecurity. And it's just one of the most creative campaigns I've seen in a long time.
Wow.
Right? So
that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it sounds like they used, especially the first one, used humor, right? I mean, because if you can take something, because that's the other debate in B2B, using humor. Yes. Like people are afraid, and yet we all love to laugh. And all the, you look at the Super Bowl commercials, they're always the one, the most popular are always the funny ones, you know? It's so even though we say that we don't want to, we're afraid to use humor. Don't be too funny. People don't take you seriously. The commercial that just popped into my head because I just saw it recently was that E-Trade. The talking babies on the E-Trade commercials. You ever see that?
Yes.
They have a new one, and it is so hilarious because the voices are matched perfectly to these kids, and they're these babies sitting around a table talking about finances, and it's hilarious. I never knew about E-Trade until I saw those commercials. So there you go, and But what's interesting is as you're talking, I'm asking myself, is it really the story behind the brand, or is it just in the marketing? Like, so it's the story. Is it the same thing, or is it like I'm thinking of kind of the backstory versus some like are they weaving it into the commercial? Or
I think I think it's a combination of both, because it's a part of it is like, okay, there's the camp that says, okay, this is probably just a marketing gimmick and it's a one-off thing. But I do believe, like, just looking at those two campaigns, that they were in fact linked to the brand story, to the story behind the brand. And it's a reflection of who, Cisco or BCLP are as companies, in fact. And I think to your point, Linda, about like using humor, my answer to that really is it depends, right? I think that there's a place and time, like with AI, there's a place and time for it. And there's a place and time where you probably, it's not avoid using humor. You just have to be careful about how you use it.
Right.
Right. And I've seen that, like, because I suppose also it depends again on the geography, the market, and the demographic that you're appealing to. Because I've seen this like in my years in Asia, where something that's funny in North America can totally backfire in
Sure.
Asia, right? Things can get lost in translation, or there are just these cultural nuances that maybe the marketing team and the other geography are not aware of, and they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh well, it worked here, and it was so successful. It's definitely going to make waves in these other markets." And to which I always say, "Yeah, it'll make waves, but more like a tsunami, and not
Right. Right.
so it's not in a good way, right?" Mm.
It was so funny because, as you know, my mother was Japanese, my late mom, and
Yes.
she did not get a lot of abstract like concepts. And my dad, who
Yeah.
had a really great sense of humor, would always tell these
Mm.
jokes, and she would get so super frustrated because she didn't get them, which only made it funnier. And so
Yeah.
it was like, and she would just roll her eyes and leave the room. Like, I just don't get it, And there's definitely
Absolutely.
differences culturally, and you have to be careful. But the thing with humor too is it doesn't have to be hilarious. It could just be a turn of phrase. It could be
Yeah.
just a unique way of wording something that makes,
Yeah.
kind of brings a smile. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, those are the
Exactly.
things that are a little bit safer, especially in B2B. And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
usually this is one of the rules that I learned about copywriting. And you see
Mm.
this a lot with the Apple ads, is that the heading could be humorous, but the rest of the copy needs to be really serious. Like, so the heading might be,
Correct.
like I remember they were announcing one of their phones is waterproof, and the heading just
Mhm.
said, like, PFFFFT, water. It's something to do with how water is, we don't worry about water, but the rest of
Right.
the ad was all about, it was serious, but there was
Exactly.
kind of a little flippant
Exactly.
headline, something like
Exactly.
that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
What would you suggest? Like, what would you say they should not do? Is there anything, like we just talked a little bit about, don't do this with humor? Is there anything else? Like, is there such a thing as too much story, too much backstory?
Yeah. I mean, look, in my opinion, and it's probably because I do this professionally, I don't think there's ever such a thing as too much story, but provided that the story doesn't focus on you being the company, right?
Mhm.
And this is the part where people are like, "Well, what do you mean? Like, I mean, this is our campaign, so why shouldn't it be about us?" I'm
Right.
like, okay, you're missing the point. The story should be about your customer,
Mhm.
right? The story should be about how you help your customer to succeed. So, and there's different story like telling formats, and the one that I always love to bring up is the one. It's called the hero's journey,
Yeah.
and I don't know if he coined it, but he basically like created this formula after doing all this research. So it was a professor of mythology, I think he was, Joseph Campbell, right? So he came up with a hero's journey that has 7 steps, right? So a hero has a problem, and that hero goes on a journey to find the solution, meets a guide who then gives him or her, a plan, and encourages this person to take action so that they will succeed and avert failure, right? So the hero in the story needs to be the customer, right? Make the customer the hero of the story. So that's one thing I would say you focus on, and don't stray from that path, so
Right.
to speak. I think the other thing that they shouldn't be doing is avoid talking about your product in your story, right? Avoid focusing too much on the features,
Mhm.
right? So that's one thing I would advise them to not do. The other thing I would encourage them to do, because I know some of them haven't done this, is talk to your customers,
I know.
right? Conduct those customer interviews, and then you always get the, well, yeah, but then we have to talk to sales, and sales might not share the client's information or the customer's information with us. So there's going to be a bit of that pushback, and you and I had that conversation previously. But I think it's imperative, right? And I'm sure you've seen this throughout your career. If you look at a piece of content, it's really obvious if somebody has never spoken to a customer,
Right.
because it's reflected in the content.
Yeah. And they think, and that's the problem, is that a lot of times people don't know what they don't know, or they're looking at it.
Right.
Well, this sounds great. And everyone in the company thinks it's great. But as I said before, if you're inhaling your own fumes and it's like you're not talking to anybody else, then you're leaving out a huge part of, what the value is to that person or potential value. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate this, Christian. It's been such great information. Anything else you wanted to
My
add
pleasure.
that we should know about? Like say a company says, okay, I'm going to really work on improving, my content and make it less boring. What are a couple of things they can do right off the bat to create a story or find a story?
Yeah, I mean, and this is probably like content marketing 101, but just do a little bit of an audit of your existing content and see what's working. And what I mean by that is like, okay, what has the most downloads, what gets the most likes on social media, et cetera, what has the most eyeballs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also have a look at what's not working, because that's equally as important, or if not, I would say even more important, because then you know that, okay, maybe we either A, should avoid talking about this topic in the future, or B, find a way to tweak it or approach it from a different angle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great one that I actually didn't bring up earlier. If people are running out of ideas, right? Or I don't know if you've heard this. I've heard this a couple of times working with some customers, where they say, okay, we don't actually have a story. We don't have anything to write about pertaining to this topic, et cetera, et cetera. And to that, I always say, well, there's more than one angle to tell a story, right? So you have to use the journalist's eye and be able to tell that story from a different angle and a different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because maybe you're looking at it like, because I do like drawing in my spare time, and sometimes like there's one way to draw it, like 2D, but then you can also draw it from 3D. You can draw it from a different angle, from the top and from the bottom, et cetera, right? So that's what I would encourage them to do.
Yeah.
Right. The other one is also, again, it's to conduct those customer interviews, because really by conducting those interviews, you'll be able to extract those insights, particularly around what the customers' challenges are and what they're facing. But, not to be all negative about it, but, on the other side, also look to what their aspirations are and what they hope to achieve and what their goals are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that way you can also create a story where you can spin a story about, like, how you as a service provider might be the right partner for them,
Mm-hmm.
because you have that knowledge, you have that expertise, you have that know-how, and you can help them to succeed.
Exactly. And what is the transformation they can expect from working with you?
Correct.
It's how it always,
That's right.
The end result
Yeah.
is. Well, this has been great. So where can people find you if they want to know more about what you do, or if they are interested in working with you?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation. You can find me on LinkedIn. I think there's a couple of Christian Klepps, and they're all in Europe. But I'm the only one on LinkedIn, I think, with Einblick Consulting. So my handle is Christian Klepp, Einblick Consulting. So Einblick is EINBLICK in consulting. Or you can check out our website at einblick.co. And you can also tune into my podcast, B2B Marketers on a Mission. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Linda on my show as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll put all those links to everything in the show notes. And thank you again. This has been great. I appreciate it.
Thank you.